LG provided the monitor for this review, but they don't get any input on the editorial direction of this video. Now, I don't think this monitor needs much of an introduction. It's the first 27-inch gaming monitor that has an OLED panel. Safe to say that I'm pretty excited about this review, because apart from the OLED panel, this actually is a classic 27-inch 1440p gaming monitor with a 240Hz refresh rate. And personally, I'm a big fan of this class of monitors. Anyway, OLED. So, as you'd expect, the black level is perfect. It's honestly kind of an unreal experience when you turn on this monitor for the first time. Like, if you have a wallpaper that has black in it and switch to this OLED monitor, it just looks so much more crisp than on your regular LCD display. But this monitor is a bit different than your typical OLED TV. Like, yeah, it's smaller, but it also has a different coating. OLED TVs are typically glossy, but here we're getting a matte coating. Very similar to what you find on a regular IPS or VA panel. And I really don't want to discuss this in too much detail, but matte as well as glossy panels have their own pros and cons. I find matte to be a pretty reasonable choice for a monitor, especially for a monitor that doesn't get very bright. More on that in a bit. But yeah, at the same time, I'd love to see what this monitor would look like with a glossy finish. I really hope that we're gonna see a glossy version pop up in the near future. For now though, I really don't mind the matte coating as it's pretty smooth and honestly doesn't really take away from the fact that blacks look amazing on this monitor. Of course, less so when you're using it in a bright room, but bright lights and reflections don't really go well with all kinds of coatings. So either way, you want to control the ambient light with any kind of coating for the best experience. Generally, this monitor is not very well suited for bright rooms. At max, you can squeeze out roughly 250 nits out of this panel. At least with a small tweak I'm gonna show you in a bit. 200 to 250 nits peak brightness are perfectly fine if you can block off sunlight, and more than enough if you're using this monitor at night. Though when the sun is bursting through your window, you're not gonna be happy with the max brightness. LG probably have chosen the max brightness pretty conservatively to mitigate the issue of burn-in. And as this monitor just hit the market, we don't really know yet how much of an issue burn-in actually is with this monitor. So if you want to be on the safe side, you probably don't want to use the settings I'm about to show you next. First up, I'm gonna turn off the smart energy saving option. The default setting is high, which makes things like websites in dark mode look a bit too dark sometimes and kinda hard to read. It's a bit inconsistent and really not a setting I recommend using unless you're super concerned about saving energy. Now, by changing the contrast from 60 to 70, you can actually gain about 50 nits of peak brightness. 70 is the actual clipping point of white, so you won't gain anything by going higher than this. Interestingly enough, this setting seems to trigger some kind of safety feature, I guess. Because with the contrast at 70, the monitor will slightly dim down full screen white. Not something you'll encounter all the time, as something like a dark menu bar is enough that the monitor doesn't dim, but kinda interesting nevertheless. So here's the complete overview of the settings that I recommend using in case you don't have access to a colorimeter. I'd also recommend using the ICC profile that I made in conjunction with these settings. Download link in the video description. If you're concerned about potential burn-in, I'd suggest leaving the contrast at 60 if that's bright enough for you. Anyway, in HDR mode, we're getting a far higher peak brightness of about 670 nits, but only when small parts of the screen need to be bright. Full screen white is kept at 141 nits, which isn't very impressive to say the least. Despite that, HDR still looks amazing. Especially dark scenes. Like here where the background is completely black, the OLED tech really flexes its muscles and makes colors pop against the black background. This isn't the type of HDR though that makes you want to wear like sunglasses when there's a sunny beach scene or something like that really would need a high full screen brightness. It's more like the type of HDR you're gonna be enjoying in a dimmed room and be impressed by the shadow detail and with how clear bright highlights look in dark scenes. When it comes to HDR accuracy, LG did a decent job. The eOTF tracking is basically on point, which is great to see, though the grayscale performance isn't amazing, and I'm not a big fan of the locked RGB controls, and that we basically can't make any color-related adjustments in the OSD menu in HDR mode. Now for gaming, I really enjoy this monitor. I mean, you'd already expect crazy fast response times from OLED, but this one has double the refresh rate of our good old OLED TVs, which is pretty nice. As you can see, there's a pretty substantial difference in motion clarity between 120 and 240 Hz. Now let's take a closer look at the response time's performance. Unlike with a regular LCD display, there are no overdrive modes to choose from, which is kinda interesting. But I really don't mind it, because this is what the only mode looks like. Safe to say that this is an excellent result. Even with this very strict testing methodology, this is a legit 1 millisecond response time monitor. Interestingly enough though, there is overshoot as indicated by the orange fields on the right. Though, despite that almost the whole tail is orange, this really is very minimal overshoot and not actually something you're gonna notice in-game. Also, what I find very interesting is that the overshoot on this OLED monitor is a bit different than on a regular LCD monitor. Like, as we can see here with the transition from RGB 0 to RGB 153. This right here is the overshoot, and after 4.2 milliseconds it fades instantly and reaches the target value, which is kinda odd and quite different from how LCDs behave. 4.2 milliseconds is exactly the time it takes a 240 Hz panel to refresh, so the overshoot lasts for exactly a single refresh cycle. Now, as you can imagine, this holds a few implications for lower refresh rates. And yeah, as you would expect, the overshoot becomes more noticeable the lower the refresh rate gets. At 240 Hz, there's really no visible overshoot. And down to 144 Hz, the image still looks pretty clean. But at 120 Hz and below, the inverse ghosting starts getting a bit too much. Not like it's unusable or distracting in-game, but it's truly not optimal. For a 240 Hz monitor, this isn't really a huge concern in my opinion, especially as the 240 Hz performance is so good. So how does it compare to our good old LCD monitors? Well, these are a few of the fastest monitors I've tested so far, and I have to say that the LG OLED beats them all. It even looks clearer than the 390 Hz IPS monitor from Acer or the Omen X25, which has a very fast 240 Hz TN panel. And in case you're curious, this is how the response times compare. And yeah, the OLED is a good bit faster than the 240 Hz Omen X25, which previously was the fastest monitor I've ever measured. Really, the only way these LCDs can rival the OLED's motion performance is with the help of backlight strobing. I'd love to see how the OLED would stack up with black frame insertion, which is the OLED equivalent of backlight strobing. But unfortunately, LG didn't implement such a feature. But this doesn't change the fact that this is an insanely good monitor for competitive gaming. However, you might be very disappointed when you boot up certain games for the first time. Because with some games, including Valorant and a few others, this monitor straight up refuses to run at 240 Hz. Instead, it'll run at 120 Hz in downscaled UHD. A quick and dirty fix is using the windowed full screen mode. This will make the monitor run at 240 Hz, but comes with the typical drawbacks of not using the actual full screen mode. To actually solve this issue, you gotta use the custom resolution utility by ToastDX. With this program, you can delete the so-called TV resolutions exposed by the monitor, which are responsible for this issue. This is pretty straightforward, but I'll leave a link to a Reddit post that describes this in a bit more detail down below. After you've done this and restarted your drivers, the monitor will default to 240 Hz 1440p, as you would expect. Now, I've contacted LG about this issue, and they told me that this is caused by the NVIDIA driver, and NVIDIA are working on an update to resolve this issue. So I wonder if that's a problem with AMD GPUs as well, so please leave a comment down below if you're using this monitor with an AMD graphics card. Now, of course, I'm not happy to see issues like this, but I'm willing to give LG the benefit of the doubt here for now, as it might actually be NVIDIA's fault. Anyway, after quickly fixing this with CRU, I have to say that I really enjoy this monitor for games like Valorant. Competitive gamers will also be happy to hear that the display lag is pretty low. Technically, 0.7 milliseconds of processing lag is a bit on the higher side, but realistically, that's not something that's noticeable. Especially as the total display lag is just 2.8 milliseconds, which is pretty fast. And it's the same with and without adaptive sync. Now I have to say that I'm not 100% happy with the adaptive sync performance. This monitor is certified by NVIDIA as G-Sync compatible, which usually indicates that the G-Sync or adaptive sync performance is flawless. and it mostly works as intended and prevents tearing. LFC kicks in at 59 FPS and also does a good job. Though in some scenarios I can notice a faint flickering with adaptive sync. It doesn't really show up in my usual stress tests, which is a bit weird, but I do notice this in Valorant and sometimes even on the desktop. It's a faint flickering, which really doesn't occur often, and it isn't like super noticeable. But this is something you should keep in mind if you're a big fan of adaptive sync and somewhat sensitive to flickering. Now when it comes to color saturation, this new OLED panel isn't that different from our typical IPS or VA panel. It's a wide gamut panel with roughly 1.4 times the color gamut volume of sRGB and Adobe RGB and DCI-P3 coverages around the 90% mark. Really nothing out of the ordinary. The factory calibration, though, is exceptionally bad. This is not exactly a cheap monitor, so I'd expect a much better factory setup. The sRGB mode isn't that bad, but this still isn't something I'd want to use without making adjustments. Luckily, LG didn't block the RGB controls in the sRGB mode, which is great to see, so you can actually fix the white point yourself. After some adjustments, the normal native gamut mode also becomes much better. The high delta E is somewhat expected, as we're looking at a wide gamut monitor. A full calibration gets rid of this issue, though the maximum delta E is a bit too high to consider this monitor for professional color work. Generally, I don't think this monitor is optimal for content creation, as it also has a few other issues caused by its subpixel layout. Its subpixels are arranged in an RW/BG layout, which is quite different from our ordinary RGB pixel. And this causes visual artifacts that are especially noticeable with certain text and graphics with sharp edges. Like, take a look at what happens when I highlight this text. There's quite a heavy amount of red and green fringing going on. Yellow is probably the most difficult color for this panel, so this is kind of a worst case scenario. But this is something you're definitely gonna notice whenever there's something yellow with a high contrast edge. The red and green subpixel that compose yellow are quite far apart in this layout, so there will be red fringing on the left and green fringing on the right. Therefore, I really cannot recommend this monitor for graphic design or even photo or video editing, as I feel the color fringing is way too distracting. I mean, sure, if you're editing like one photo a month as a hobby, this really isn't a huge issue. But I wouldn't recommend this monitor for more serious content creation. For text, I actually don't mind the pixel layout as much as I thought I would. Sure, if all your text is highlighted in yellow, it will look awful. But black text on a white background can actually look really clean. I definitely recommend using ClearType, but after a ClearType run, text in Word is actually looking basically as good as with a regular RGB layout panel. It doesn't really translate well over camera, so I guess you have to trust me that the text clearly improved a lot with ClearType and looks really good. Unfortunately though, ClearType doesn't apply to text in every program and graphics aren't affected either, so this doesn't get rid of the issue entirely. White text on grey background also doesn't look great, so after all this isn't the very best experience when it comes to reading text. The weird subpixel layout mostly does not affect gaming or content consumption. In rare cases, like when you're using a yellow crosshair, you're gonna see fringing though. But to be fair, it's unlikely that this will keep you from hitting your headshots, so I'd consider this a non-issue for gaming. Though there's a good chance that you'll dislike the stand design if you're playing a lot of FPS games. The stand is quite large side to side, and the metal feet are placed in a way that I can totally see myself hitting it with my mouse. At least the display is mounted near to the front, so you can get it pretty close to you without getting overly close to your mouse. I also like the adjustment range of the stand. The max height is actually very high, which I find pretty useful. Tilt, swivel and pivot are adjustable as well. Usually I'm not a big fan of RGB lights on a monitor, but in this case the light is decently bright and is actually quite useful as a bias light and if you're using a keyboard without a backlight. I'm not sure though what to think about this remote. Sure, it's nice that this monitor comes with a remote, but in return LG got rid of any useful controls on the monitor. I mean, there is a single button on the bottom of the screen, but this is not a directional toggle, but an actual button. You can change certain settings by performing a combination of short and long button presses, but this honestly is just ridiculously cumbersome, so you better don't lose the remote. Now anyway, I think throughout this review it's become pretty clear that this monitor basically demolishes LCD monitors in certain areas. I mean, you're simply not gonna get these levels of contrast from an IPS or even a VA panel. But in return, you gotta accept a few drawbacks over traditional LCDs, in addition to the higher asking price, obviously. Personally, I find the color fringing that's caused by the subpixel layout rather annoying when browsing through the web, and the low max brightness is a bit challenging on a sunny day. This monitor made me using my window blinds a lot more than I wanted to. In the evening though, for watching videos or playing Valorant, the OLED panel is just amazing. Contrast is insane, HDR looks great in a dark room, and the response times are faster than anything else. So yeah, if that's what you do, like using your monitor at evening or in a dimmed room, for gaming and watching videos, this is just an amazing monitor. But if you're rather looking for something a bit more versatile, I'd suggest watching my review of the AW2723DF. It has similar specs, but if you're using your monitor in a bright room, and also working a lot with text or graphics, a super bright IPS panel will make those things quite a bit easier, even though it lacks the wow factor of the OLED panel. Thanks for watching, bis zum nächsten Video.